Recorded in sinfully sunny Las Vegas, Nevada. Avantpop Bookstore presents interviews. For our first podcast, we have music journalist Eric Gladstone joining us. Eric was a prominent writer in the 90s, covering bands such as Ween, Sonic Youth, Michael Franti, and Disposable Heroes of Hiphoprisy, the Smashing Pumpkins, Jesus Lizard, the Rollins Band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Monster Magnet, Mudhoney, the Dust Brothers, the Beastie Boys, Beck, Dr. Octagon, Ozomatli, the Foo Fighters, Pavement, Pigface, even Spinal Tap and GWAR. He was at the first Tibetan Freedom Concert and the Reading Festival in Europe. Eric Gladstone, we're excited to have him. His book, Anything But Nirvana. My name is Shwa Laytart. Welcome to Avantpop Bookstore Presents. Well, you had a lot of free thinkers in your past. So
I have.
Joining me now, I've got Eric Gladstone, who is, I hate to say, is 3 doors down from the bookstore.
Remember them?
The author of Anything But Nirvana, your book you launched on your own, self-published, available at Avantpop Bookstore. I have a whole introduction I did with already naming everybody you've worked for and some of the bands. It's pretty impressive. Like I told you before, I've read your stuff, and you were discovering bands that I was discovering at that same time that I'd never thought many people were fans of, and you were actually getting them in print, which is huge.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really flattering to be able to come back and connect with people through putting my writing back out there. That's really cool, actually. Because a lot of what I did try to do as a writer, and it was definitely conscious. It was definitely a conscious thing that I wanted to write about bands that I felt weren't getting the attention that they should. And there were bands that I felt strongly about. And this is what sort of brought me to a lot of great things in my career as a music writer, but it also sort of forecasted the end of my music career. My career as a music writer, because it's just like with any pursuit, it's very difficult to get to you're going to hit your head on the ceiling at a certain point when you're just doing the stuff that you love, period.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
You have a retail business here, right? You don't love to death every single book that you sell.
Right.
You can't. It's just not pragmatic. But when you're a writer and you really want to be writing about, you want to be championing bands, and you want to feel like your article is hopefully going to make some kind of a difference in telling people about a band, you're going to get to a point where you're going to have to write about a band. Like in my case, I got an opportunity to write in Rolling Stone, and the band was Korn. I got an opportunity to write in Rolling Stone, and the band was Korn.
Yeah.
So I wrote the very first story on Korn in Rolling Stone. It's not in the book. It's not work that I'm really that proud of. It actually is almost the only story of mine that you can find online. Ironically. Yeah. And I don't know why. But it got me in Rolling Stone, and I sort of thought I would go further in Rolling Stone until I realized that I was going to keep having to do stories like that. And I was like, I don't know. Why don't I go do something else that I don't like and get paid better? I did manage to get Cool Keith and Dr. Octagon in Rolling Stone, and I'm really proud of that. And that is in the book.
Yeah. Well, let's start back at the beginning, because you broke one of, as far as the fans are concerned, the greatest band ever, and that was Ween. How did that come about? You were working at a record store?
I can't say that I really broke them, but I definitely wrote the first national article about them that wasn't in some tiny fanzine or something like that. I was really proud of that. So they were a local band. They were kids. I'm not even sure if they were out of high school. They were a local band. They were literally playing in like living rooms and stuff like that. It was literally Aaron and Gene and Dean, Aaron and Mickey, and a tape recorder. I mean, a cassette recorder. And they started performing at my local bar. They were really good friends with my friend, the late William Tucker was his guitar teacher, and he was also the guy who ended up producing my band and he's also represented here in Pigface. He's in the band and in ministry. So he was a connector in a lot of ways. So that's how I knew them. They were a local band. They were about to emerge. They got a deal with Twin Tone, which was like the Replacements label, more or less. That was the label that launched them. And so it was like, oh, local band is going to do something. And they were just brilliant. I mean, it was obvious they were brilliant. It was like, if you couldn't see that they were brilliant, I don't know what's wrong with you, So it was an opportunity for them, but it was also an opportunity for me to go to a national magazine, which was Alternative Press, and say, hey, you really need to be writing about Ween. This band is amazing, and I'm really close with them, and they're doing all this stuff. And they said, oh, yeah, they had seen the thing from Twin Tone, and they were like, yeah, this band seems crazy, so go do it. So it was really an opportunity for both of us at the same time. And I'm really fortunate. It's insane that they've been around as long as they have been and gathered as many fans as they have. And that is an amazing thing to watch, the trajectory of a career that literally started in living rooms and, crappy apartments and, basements, and go to selling out how many nights at Red Rock and stuff like that they do now. It's amazing. I love those guys.
Yeah. Me too. That was that at that time. That to me was the ultimate alternative with the music they were doing, because they were just all over the place.
No boundaries at all.
Yeah,
none at all. They didn't even necessarily want to be identified as alternative, because they thought, well, that's just another boundary, also. Right. And they were actually they were unabashed fans of lots of classic rock. So it was weird, in some ways. They were the first kind of almost reactionary wave in a way, because they were not like punk rock in terms of forget everything from the past. They were like, we don't care. We love Prince. We love Neil Young. We love whatever you're going to put in front of us that's actually really good in its own sake, and we're going to digest that and do something with it, and they would keep playing you these tapes of anything they did, and they just didn't have any boundaries. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. They still don't, I don't think. Yeah.
Now, another one of the bands that I love that you wrote about was Michael Franti and the Disposable. This is before Spearhead. Yeah. With his, which I thought at that time, that's what industrial music was, the Disposable Heroes of Hiphoprisy. Yeah. Because they had the other band member who was like dragging chains.
Yeah, he was literally making noise with machines and power tools and stuff like that. And I got to see them live once, actually, at New York and Wetlands. And that was actually a super great gig, and I'm really glad I got to see that. That was an amazing thing. But yeah, Michael Franti was a fascinating guy, and Disposable Heroes of Hiphoprisy, again, I thought were an amazing fusion between the industrial world, like you said, and hip-hop. And in the early 90s, hip-hop was really going in so many different, really cool, very creative directions. It was really so incredibly different from what it is now. And it was really trying to do different things with music in the same way that hard bop was in the 50s and 40s and 60s, or whatever else, psychedelic music. It was really exciting, and I thought Franti was really sharp and really passionate and had a lot to talk about. I'm really proud of that piece. He didn't do a lot of pieces like that, Right. And I got to do one more with him, actually, when he started Spearhead, and I thought, oh, Spearhead's cool. Spearhead's nice, and I'm really glad to see that he's made a career out of it. The earlier, angrier version of him was what I thought was really lasting and great, but I'm glad that he's happy.
Yeah, and as I gravitated to that more activist stuff that he was doing too. Yeah. But as somebody who lived up in Northern California for a long time, he definitely he captures that vibe
Yeah.
up there, and you know, I mean, he's like a Bob Marley. You know, he really went with that spiritual,
Yeah.
like we can get through, you know, the apocalypse vibe. And
Yeah,
I tell you, man,
right.
his music, it's amazing to see people resonate with that. His music, you know, his shows,
great, yeah.
and, you know, the people that just love that dude.
But I mean, you know, it's funny because he was woke before woke was woke. He was as woke as it gets. you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now your Pigface connection.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that, because that's such an interesting one too. I mean, your record collection, CD collection, must be massive, because you are as well all over the place with the music that you covered.
I have, I've got a decent amount of vinyl. I don't have so much vinyl that it's sort of like making the floors bow or anything like that. I'm not sort of a pack rat, but I do have a decent amount of vinyl. Yeah, and I do love listening to vinyl, and it's really kind of like it's become my failsafe again, just listening to vinyl. The Pigface thing all kind of came out again from the when I pop my pee. Little radio talk for you out there in Radio Land. The Pigface thing came about because the whole, maybe we should backtrack a little bit. So I got my start writing and in the music world. I was interested in high school, but I didn't know what to do with it. I was so close to so many things, but I never sort of got any real connections. But then when I went to college in New Jersey at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, which is central Jersey, there was just a very healthy music scene going on there. And I'm not saying it was very well supported. It wasn't like a New Orleans or a Chicago where there was a really healthy scene. There were a couple of clubs and the college itself sort of supporting live shows and things like that. But it was enough to have a fairly healthy scene and a really creative scene. What was really interesting about the scene there was that New Jersey is a fascinating place because it has a chip on both shoulders. If you live in New Jersey, and I'm sure that a lot of Jersey people will relate to this, you feel like you're not good enough for New York or Philly. You feel like people are looking down at you from two directions. The truth is that there's an incredible amount of talent and ability in New Jersey, and it's also a nicer place than most people think. And there's a lot of good things to say about it, but it has this inferiority complex. Okay, but inferiority complexes actually can create great art a lot. So there were a lot of super creative people there, and all of them it was almost an unspoken thing that you had to be ferociously original. You couldn't be seen as copying anyone else, even in the slightest, or people would just take you down. At least at this time, in the mid 80s. And that's how you get a Ween, who are just like incredibly original. I also, one of the first bands coming up out of that scene were the Smithereens, who I write about in here too. And I had a really close relationship with them when they were just starting to emerge, and was really able to see that happen on a national level, which was amazing. And then there was a Trenton music scene as well, and William Tucker came out of that scene, and he was doing things with crazy bands like the Scornflakes and Regressive Aid, and these bands ended up, the other part of there was a band called Scornflakes, and the rhythm section of that became the rhythm section of the Rollins Band, which is sort of how I connected with Henry Rollins. And there's just all these interconnections, and William Tucker, as I said, was Mickey from Ween's guitar teacher. He was a really great guitar teacher. Also at the time, Martin Atkins, who had been in Public Image Limited, was living in New Brunswick for very random reasons. But he was on the periphery of the scene. And I got friendly with Martin Atkins when I was a DJ on the college radio station, and I was a big fan of Public Image. And they had just come out with a new Live in Tokyo album. They already had a Live in Paris album. So me being a very snotty college radio DJ, I said, well, they've got a new Live in Tokyo album, but I think it stinks. So I'm going to play something from the Live in Paris album. And the phone rings, and it's Martin Atkins. And I'm like, okay. He said, you're right, you know? And I'm like, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. So you're not going to beat me up or something? He's like, no, you're totally right. You know, like I'll buy you a beer sometime. I'll tell you a lot more about it, probably more than you want to know. You know, so our friendship sort of started off from there. And we're close to this day. He ended up putting my band's record out, and I helped him with launching a label, and William Tucker was involved with music there too. So anyway, there were all these connections. So William Tucker was involved with him. He started playing with Killing Joke. Then he got connected with the Ministry guys. Then he brought William in to play with the Ministry guys. Then after a Ministry tour, bits of which are documented in the appendix of the story, everyone except the guys in Ministry, so Ministry had assembled this amazing touring band, because they're really a studio band. And all the guys in the touring band were like, well, they were all really super creative. And they're just like, we're chomping at the bit, playing like boom, 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 night after night after night, you know? So at the end of it, Martin, who's endlessly trying to get things going, and he's always trying to get things going with the least amount of financial backing, basically. He's like rubbing two sticks together all the time. And I don't know why, but that always seems to be how his modus. So he says to all these guys, hey, I booked some studio time. Let's just go in and jam. And that's how Pigface was created, first out of that first jam. And he was like, wow, I've really got something kind of cool here. And it became eventually this amorphous thing with players coming and going and leaving and coming in, and this weird, you know, Grateful Dead and Friends type scenario of industrial music.
Yeah.
And I think over the history of it, you know, there's hits and misses like that kind of thing does. But it was really cool, again, to document that piece in this book. I had some experience with Ministry and Revolting Cocks and all of that stuff, but all of the pieces that I did with them, none of them really reflected what my whole experience was in that world. And I didn't want to write a new piece. So that's why Ministry is sort of only tangentially in this book. But the whole Ministry connection was definitely a big piece of, you know, my writing career and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the sounds. I'm a huge Ministry fan. And that was one of the sounds. And My Life with a Thrill Kill Cult.
Yeah.
Which, you know, crossed over, it seemed.
So there you go. Like I did the first cover story on Thrill Kill Cult. And Tucker went on tour with them also. Yeah. And that was fun. So I was I was in Wax Track Studios with all of these guys. There was lots of like bits and pieces. I did a lot of stuff with that. Yeah, it was really kind of just an interesting, crazy world with a lot of interesting, crazy people.
I can imagine. I mean, just hearing Al talk about some of those times, and you don't get much.
Well, and he was such a circus master too. You know, I mean, he was a ringleader in the true sense, and a circus master, very much like George Clinton. You know, kind of like wind everyone up and watch them go. And then, but he was also part prince. You know, I mean, he was also very smart by himself at times. But it depended, and you know. He messed around with a lot of dumb stuff, and he got himself into trouble, and somehow he got himself out of it again. I don't know. That guy's a real human cockroach, you know.
Did you hear the stories that Winona Ryder's dad, a psychologist, worked with Timothy Leary, and Al was a guinea pig. He was a drug tester for him, and they have all these like notes of Al. So word on the street.
I have not heard that. It wouldn't shock me. But it's funny. And a side note to that, I actually saw Ministry in their original phase open up for Depeche Mode the first time Depeche Mode played the U.S. This is in 1981.
Wow. Yeah,
the one show. They opened up for them, and I was like, "Who the heck are these guys?
So
corny and terrible and awful."
Al was described as the Howard Jones of.
It was very much the pop version of what he wanted to do, and then he sort of like realized that he didn't want to be that. He wanted to have more edge to what he was doing, but there was no roadmap for Ministry. You know, it took bands like Einstände Neubauten and other crazy guys out of Europe to kind of give him the courage to go in the direction he went. I think.
Now, how did you go from East Coast to then like Mudhoney?
Well, I mean, so I got to Mudhoney fairly late in their career, actually. It's funny. Although my band opened for them once.
What was the name of your band?
My band was called Leather Studded Diaphragm. And it was meant to be, the band was pretty popular locally in New Jersey, but it never went much farther than that. But it was sort of meant to mock everything in its, everything it could reach, so including ourselves, so it was definitely punk and a little industrial and a little goth, but it was sort of making fun of everything at the same time too, sort of semi-satirical, which is a hard sell. But we opened up for a lot of great bands. Mudhoney was one of them. But Mudhoney, I was not, I didn't necessarily love everything that grunge presented.
Right.
I wasn't as impressed by a lot of it as other people were. I didn't think Nirvana's first record was any good.
Bleach?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I didn't really like it at all. Oh. I didn't like. I thought Screaming Trees were really good.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't like Soundgarden. So and this sort of like, again, to go off on a tangent, this sort of says a lot about my writing career and what I did, because I was very contrary a lot of the time. And it's not because I like being contrary. It's just kind of like, well, no, I don't love the band that everyone else has decided are geniuses. I think this other more obscure band is way more interesting. I don't, I don't, so I didn't necessarily ascribe to a lot of things. That's maybe part of what leads into the name of the book and the whole thing about Nirvana. I did obviously pitch some stories about Nirvana, but it wasn't until it was obvious they were going to be huge, and it was almost out of a sense of obligation, and I think it's good that I never got to write about them, because I probably would have been like, I don't get you guys, I mean, the Sonic Youth story in here, which I'm actually kind of proud of, that's a little bit of, I don't get you guys, or I'm not just going to like sit there and think everything you do is brilliant, which journalistically I think is a better position to have, but that's not usually what happens with music journalism. Usually the people who are writing about bands and music journalism are the ones who have decided a band is great, Yeah. You don't send someone who thinks, Aretha Franklin is the best soul singer ever to go interview Tina Turner.
Right.
So I was not, I was not someone who thought grunge was the be all and end all. I thought a lot of it was, pretty disposable, and Mudhoney in particular, I was like, I don't get it. They seem like cool guys. They definitely had great influences. It's one of my best friends at the time actually signed them to Warner Brothers Records, and I didn't have the guts to be like, yeah, I don't get it. I don't get it. And it wasn't until their later stuff, that Tomorrow Hits Today, and the fact that they were working with Jim Dickinson, who was a legend, and that they were getting more swamp rocky, I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Now you're being interesting, and now you're going into new places, and you're trying to explore your influences in different ways. And guess what? It's their least popular album.
Yeah.
But I thought it was great, and the experience of working with them was great too.
Yeah. Yeah. I just like they were before Nirvana, they were that grunge sound up there that
right.
Was happening long before the guys even I think were in that area.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear
Mudhoney, Green River,
yeah,
all those bands?
Yeah, exactly.
So I was on college radio during that whole period, Love Buzz and all that stuff, and Nirvana were not necessarily the ones who anyone expected to emerge. It was Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam obviously did. Well, both those guys did. And I'm trying to think of the other bands, but there were a bunch of bands. But to me, they almost all sounded really kind of loud and indistinct. I was like, where are the songs?
You ever hear Mark from Mudhoney, his side project, the Monkey Wrench?
Yeah.
A lot, more bluesy.
Yeah.
And I mean, lyrics are just amazing. He was a great songwriter, lyricist. But yeah, you had so much of that. But that was also at the same time, there was also that like LA sound that was happening. That was the chili pepper funky, and NorCal had that funk pop, fungo
Right.
mungo, a bunch of that like
Yeah, there
limbo
was sort of-
maniac style.
Right. So there was this in the early '80s. There was a real post-punk funk thing that came out of England and New York a little bit, and I loved that stuff. And then sort of California, I think, tried to adopt that, and some of it was cool. Some of it went somewhere. Obviously, the Chili Peppers are all still around.
Yeah.
That was another interesting experience where once I finally talked to them, again, it was like what's considered to be their least popular album, but it was a fascinating experience for me, and I still thought worth reading, and I still think it's a good piece about who they are as people,
Yeah.
They did the one album with Dave Navarro, which seemed like a good pairing actually, but I think it was, I think it just wasn't. They didn't know what direction they wanted to go into. At that point.
Yeah.
This is the thing about music journalism. You can't necessarily time perfectly when you're going to talk to people. You take the chances when you can take them. Sometimes it works out great. Sometimes it doesn't. In the case of Beck, it really worked out great for me because I was in the studio when he was making Odelay, and it's just sort of like, as I wrote in the intro to that piece, I just kept running into him in different places because we lived so close together, and he was just very accessible at that point, and I really liked what came out of that as a story because it has that feeling of like, oh, there's just this guy around, and all of a sudden the whole world knows about him. But it's really interesting to see that, to be able to document that transition, and it doesn't happen very much anymore, I think, in journalism. I think it happened a lot in the 60s when things were way more open with new journalism.
Yeah.
and then it started to happen less and less, and I think I really was just able to grab onto the tail end of that accessibility, and that not just accessibility, but a lack of self-consciousness, sort of not worrying about your public image every second. I think it's probably hard for a lot of people to imagine that pre-internet era, the pre-social media era, when you weren't really so self-conscious all the time,
Yeah.
And you weren't thinking of like, oh, how am I going to package and present this moment in my life? You were just living, you know. Grunge as a music thing, grunge as a musical movement doesn't exist in a world where you're self-conscious, It just doesn't. It would never happen. And so many other things, it's hard to develop. But I think that the kind of journalism that I was able to do in this book, the kind of writing I was able to do in this book, is really hard to happen in a more self-conscious era,
Yeah, and I mean your style, the new journalism, in there on the spot. I mean, you got thousands of words to work with that you don't see that anymore either, especially in music journalism. Unless it's a top band, Monster Magnet. Now, how did you find those guys? That was one of those obscure ones that.
Look, I'm thrilled that anyone knows Monster Magnet. They're definitely a personal favorite.
Yeah.
That was another Jersey band. They were on the same scene, but they didn't really feel connected to anyone else. But their club shows were insane.
Oh yeah.
Same as Flaming Lips were around the same time.
Yeah.
Flaming Lips' club shows were just like epically
I saw
insane.
a couple of those early ones myself.
Those guys, Butthole Surfers, Monster Magnet, were trying to tap into that idea of just like taking what they were promised in the biker movies of the late of the late 60s, these biker movies that were of course fantasies.
Yeah.
They were like, we were promised this, and they were going to make it happen. They definitely were like taking this idea and saying, we're going to make this happen. We're going to turn cartoon ideas into real life, and that's how GWAR emerged too.
Yeah.
And it's amazing GWAR's still around. But yeah, that's Monster Magnet were a local band, and they were just amazingly good local. And the fact that they started to emerge nationally. I got to write the first national story about them too, which is really great. Although the story that's in here is the second story I did with Dave. But yeah, he was just such a great character, and they're so fun and just like a really pure band.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And that space stoner rock,
Right.
with aliens and other dimensions. Like his lyrics were so out there. You combine drugs
And like he knew what he was talking about too. He was not. He understood the references he was making.
That's what I loved about it. He was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at that time, I was really into it all myself. So to stumble across, from Spine of Gods, that album was just. That just blew my mind.
Yeah, that was
when
the
that
record.
one came out.
And that was recorded on like a 4-track in someone's basement or something like that. I remember him telling me we literally like slapped together every single pedal effect we could just to see what would happen, and they'd fry out the board and do all this crazy stuff. And yeah.
I still, that's one out of all the bands here that you've covered. There's still ones that I like to throw on from time to time.
That's awesome. Yeah. And that's another example of just, I guarantee you they came out of this Jersey scene where it was just like, well, we can't imitate anyone else locally. We've got to be our own thing.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. And that's what created, I think, a lot of great bands, and I think that's a mindset that I wish was more prevalent everywhere. Now I see bands looking at other bands and thinking, we need a slice of that,
Well, that's what happened to music. And I'm preaching the choir here, but during that time period, the record labels came in and just started carbon copying whoever they can. It was just recycled, ugly Kid Joe shit.
Right, Dishwalla.
And so, finding new ones was so hard. And then when you're a real music buff, you're like constantly looking for the new music.
Yeah, and it's funny. You used to get CDs in the mail physically. You'd get them in packages, and you'd have to open up 20 packages almost every day, and that's not an exaggeration. And then go through them all. And it was a process. It would take you an hour, and I'd have to an hour of going, hitting buttons. 30 seconds. Nope. And there were some times when it really was like, you tried not to miss anything, but you could miss things, and it's funny, sort of similarly to that, I remember someone sending me something on a band with a terrible name, and she sent me a video, and she said, just look at the video. Just look at the video. It's only 10 minutes. I was like, okay. It was a VHS tape. And I ignored her for a week after a week, and she's like, did you look at it yet? No, I'm sorry, I haven't. And after 3 weeks, she calls me again. I'm like, oh my God. All right, I'm sorry. And I put on the VHS, and then I called her back, and I'm like, I feel like an idiot. This is amazing. The band was Portishead.
Ah, yes.
And so I ended up writing, it's a short piece, even in the extended version in the book, but I ended up writing about Portishead right when they were coming out. Again, it wasn't the very first story on them. They were coming out of England, but it was one of the very first, where I was just like, you guys need to look at this band. I was like, what a terrible name, they can't be any good. And you used to be very, very judgmental back then too. Yeah. That name sucks. They can't be any good.
Yeah.
And so that was great. And what's great, I think I tried to reflect in the book, is the diversity of music back then, and the diversity of music that I got to write about, which was really cool. And this is just the alternative stuff. I did get to write about a lot of old school stuff at the time too, but I felt like the book should really just focus on the alternative things.
Well, one of the articles that you did was on, a band, I guess you'd call them, that's very rarely mentioned anymore, but we're massive in helping create the Beastie Boys, and that's the Dust Brothers.
Yeah.
Nobody was, you maybe find one or two articles at all about those guys.
It's very true. They were very press shy. I think probably the only reason that I did get to write about them is I was able to become very friendly with them. I'm actually still friendly with Mike on social media. it was very interesting. So I went from living in New Jersey to living in DC for a couple of years and being in that scene. And then I moved to LA. I moved to New York for a minute, and then I moved to LA when I met my future ex-wife. And that was right about when I wrote the Red Hot Chili Peppers piece. I was flown into LA, and I think 3 months after that, I flew back and just started living there. But that was the piece where I thought I could live here, you know? And so in the east side of LA was still very kind of a close-knit scene. That's where Beck was coming out of, and the Dust Brothers were there, and there were some connections with friends, and my girlfriend at the time was connected to. They DJ'd at this club where the Beastie Boys had played, and the Beastie Boys had blown out their PA, and then they're yelling and screaming at these assholes and just treating them like shit. And those assholes ended up being Mario Caldato and John King and Mike Simpson, and and these guys ended up being their producers initially for Paul's Boutique. And then they kept working with them in various forms. Well, actually, the Dust Brothers never did another record with them, but Mario Caldato became their engineer for the rest of their career. And so I just was friendly with them because they were around and just sort of figuring things out and doing different things with different people. They were doing a bunch of different records. So I would... this is partially why I was, or a good part of why I was in the studio with Beck making Odelay, because I'd just stop in at their house. Their studio was a house in Silver Lake. It was just like a ranch house or something. And I just stop in to hang out. And it's like, oh, who's here today? Oh, hey, what's up? Like Beck was just there. Oh, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're just fucking around, you know. That fucking around became bits and pieces of Odelay, because that record took like a year to make. And then I was actually in the proper studio with them, doing it later on when they finished up at A&M Studios, I think. But so I got to know them really well, and it's true, they didn't have much interest in press. They didn't care. They weren't necessarily super eloquent. They weren't necessarily fierce self-promoters, other than, you know, getting production gigs. But other than that, they were kind of like getting high all the time and just making music. But I got to do that piece because we did, with Ray Gun magazine when I was there, we were doing an article, a whole issue on the most influential people in pop culture, according to us. And so at the time, I was like, look, the Dust Brothers need to be in this thing. They've really been, you cannot deny that they've had a huge influence at this point, you know, in that moment. And they're like, okay, you going to make it happen? And I was like, yeah, I'll make it happen. So I literally just I said I wanted to do an article, and they were like, well, we're not going to say no. They had done stuff for me at Grand Royal when I was there, the Beastie Boys magazine. So our chronology is all over the place at this point. So I had been at the Beastie Boys magazine. Obviously, that gives you a lot of cachet. Yeah. And I connected with them through that. So a year later or so, I was like, I want to do this article. And they're like, okay, because it's you, we'll do it. And also because the way I did it, they were very comfortable with it. I literally just hung out with them for a day and a night and wrote about it as I was doing it, because it was like literally the day before deadline. Yeah. So it's like I had no time to write it. I was like, well, I better just write it as it's happening. So that's how that article came about. And yeah, Mike later told me, he's like, yeah, that's the best article that's ever been written about us, which is obviously really flattering. I got that a few times in my career, actually. Always a good feeling. And that was flattering.
Well, I mean, I mean, you did get some good stuff.
Yeah.
Now, what was the this is really happening moment when you first, like, you weren't expecting to be a journalist. You're in it.
Right.
When was it like, was it right off the top with Ween, or did you finally like, wow, they're flying me around now, and like you really just took a look at it and went, wow, I'm doing this?
That's a good question. I guess there were different sort of wow, this is happening moments. Smashing Pumpkins was probably the wow, this is happening moment, because for that article, which ended up being even longer and more dramatic than it was expected, they flew me to Chicago and they flew me to LA. So, and this was this is what Billy Corgan said. This is what we want. They wanted to be on the cover of Alternative Press. I had preached it. I tried to do a story on the first album because, like, guys, this album is amazing. It's the best album of the year.
Gish.
Fucking great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, forget Seattle.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. What do you see in Seattle? I don't get it. Smashing Pumpkins, amazing band, fantastic record, right? So, but they didn't really get a lot of attention on that record. And then, so when the second one started to come out, I was already sort of like chomping at the bit. Like, guys, come on. This record's going to be huge. You know it will be. And so they gave it a cover, and they flew me to Chicago. I hung out at Billy's house with him, did all the stuff that's in the story. And then a week later, I met up with them again in the studio in LA. And so that was the moment when I thought, first of all, that they were flying me not just to one place, but to two places and putting me up in hotels and letting me have all this access. I was like, this is what I was promised. You know, this is the Almost Famous moment.
Yeah.
You know, when I saw Almost Famous came out later, I was like, these are the moments that, ring true. You know, it's like, okay, this is where you're speaking with a lower voice. Yes. Yes. Ben Fong Torres. Yeah. That's a moment. And then when I was able to take that moment and turn it into kind of an epically huge story, and then to see that story be literally just like copied and plagiarized and all this stuff by Rolling Stone and all these places because it was a huge thing. It was this huge revelation that, they weren't really a band. Billy Corgan was basically doing almost everything behind the scenes. It was a big deal. If that had happened in a social media era, it would have exploded, and it probably would have instantly been like this huge big deal. Yeah. Because it didn't happen in a social media era, and it wasn't for the big magazines, Rolling Stone or Spin. Guess what changed my life? Guess what changed in my life?
Well, not more gigs and not more money.
No, exactly.
Nothing.
Nothing very much changed. I think it was paid $800 for the rights to that story. And by the way, the reason why I could put out this book now is because I was freelance in all of these cases, and so the rights all reverted back to me. At least at that time, you didn't have to sign these work for hire contracts.
Well, one of the things I noticed too is you don't see much of people who are writing being critical, unless that's their job is to just talk shit. But you were able to, really judge a band on its talents, its merits, like everything, and be able to, point out things that aren't, solid gold. And
well,
I think
it's kind of like that's I thought that was the job.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But in the 90s especially, it seemed like no one wanted to hear any bad news about anyone. This is it's funny because now Jim DeRogatis, who was kind of a mentor, not really a mentor, but he was an influence at the time, now has become legendary for outing, now I'm blanking on his name as I do, but, sorry, you're gonna have to edit this or something. He's R. Kelly, he's become legendary for outing R. Kelly and all the scandal, but that scandal just never would have come out the way it's come out in the 90s. The 90s is when Weinstein was doing all these things that he's gotten in trouble for, and no one said anything. Right. And I was writing about independent film at the time as well. That's, something for another book or something like that. But I was doing a lot of independent film work, and I was at Miramax all the time. And I can definitely tell you that people were very well aware that Harvey Weinstein was nobody's hero, and nobody loved him, and that he was definitely doing questionable things. No one wanted to talk about that stuff at the time. No one even wanted to talk very much about drugs at the time. They were trying to talk about it as little as possible, which clearly became an issue in many, many cases, So definitely in journalism, they didn't want to hear about this stuff. and not in any way that would get people into trouble, especially because everyone was afraid of access,
Right.
Oh, well, if I talk shit about this thing, I'll never get access again, This is why it was amazing I was able to say everything that I said about Smashing Pumpkins, because it came straight from Billy. He wanted it out there,
And really, I mean, I didn't think that was any harsh criticism. Was it at the Reading Festival with
Reading Fest.
Reading, with Courtney and Danny Dildo.
Right.
And you brought up that he was dating a 16-year-old, which was
Liv Tyler.
Liv, yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And there's all kinds of other pervy stuff in there, And it's just like, that's just, and even at the time I was like, this is wrong. But I was like, oh yeah, it's wrong. Ha ha ha. That's what it was. It was like, oh yeah, that's wrong. Don't let her get too drunk. That's the way it was.
Yeah.
Which was shocking in the perspective of today, where people would just be like, like ruining careers over it, And I'm not here to defend it, but it amazed me that the slightest, you couldn't even make a slight bit of just saying this isn't right unless you wanted to be the pariah.
Right.
Shout, screaming from the mountaintop that these people were all, corrupt, awful, demons, which, they were. But they were also just people doing whatever they could get away with, So it's a fine line, I guess.
It was great because back then, your criticism and love for Courtney Love was so great because, I mean, now everybody's, leaned on that one. And
right. Well,
nobody's
at the time, especially,
time,
everyone was like, oh, poor Courtney. She's the widow and she's gone through so much. And it was kind of like, and I didn't have it out for her, but I was just like, this is not a person that seems to be really asking for anyone's sympathy, and did a lot of questionable stuff before it happened. And also things that Billy Corgan had told me about Courtney actually really colored my opinion of her. And I just, you see it in front of you and you're like, why is everyone thinking this person is so wonderful or deserves some sort of wonderful treatment? I don't get it, And like I said, that Reading Festival piece, no one would have printed that at that time. That only appeared in a fanzine that I put together with Scott Crawford, who's now a very well-regarded documentarian. He did the Cream documentary. He did documentaries about DC hardcore and a lot of cool stuff. I'm so proud of where he's gone with his career. But yeah, that no one would have printed that at the time. They just wouldn't have. Absolutely not.
Oh yeah.
So it might not seem like the harshest criticism now. It might just seem like someone ranting and having a laugh here and there, which is what I thought it was. But at the time, nobody wanted to hear anything negative about anyone, especially if they were sort of on the cool side of things, It just wasn't allowed.
Well, it was. I was thinking one of my questions was, when did you have that aha moment of it's all doomed and going down fast? But then, I think it might have been that festival with, and it was Henry Rollins.
Rollins,
you
was
crossed paths a few times.
Yeah, so that festival happened right after Rollins. The Rollins experience was incredible because, again, I approached, and that was the second. Actually, that was the third article I'd written on him. So it was like I'd spent some time really researching this guy and listening to all his talking discs and reading a lot of his books. And I did deep research on him. And that's in most cases, I did that with these pieces. But with Rollins, I really did a lot of deep research, and I knew his rhythm section really well, and there were a lot of connections. And so going on tour with him, I was like, I took it really seriously as an assignment. Again, another situation where I sort of thought I'd arrived. It was an almost famous kind of moment. Yeah. Literally going on tour for them for a week, But I wanted to really tell the truth because the guy himself was obsessed with, I tell the truth.
Right.
Tell it as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a crock of shit. Yeah. He doesn't tell it as it is. He tells it as he wants to see things. And he's very much a black and white person, or at least he was at the time. Maybe he's evolved and maybe he's a different person now. I don't care. I don't, whatever. Yeah, but at that time, that was the experience. And I thought that he would say, all right, you told it as it is, fair enough.
Right.
You know? Because that's literally all his work was about, was telling it as it is.
Yeah.
Nope. Not at all.
Yeah.
That was not how it ended up.
That was pretty surprising.
Yeah, but I'm still proud of that piece, and I read it over many, many times to see, was I wrong here? You know, maybe I was juvenile in some way or another, but no, I just told what happened, you know? So I still think it's a good story. I think it's just a good touring story, you know?
Definitely.
So it was, you know, all this stuff happened on these tours that really would never happen in a social media era, you know? And maybe it happens a little bit now, but God, it can't be anything like it used to be.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, and I just want to touch on because they're one of my all-time favorites because of Paul's Boutique, and that's you got to hang out and tour with the Beastie Boys.
Yeah. I never really toured. Well, I was on tour with them at different moments, but I never toured with them specifically. But I was, they did an amazing show right before Ill Communication came out in a small place that's now the 930 Club in D.C. And I was on the side of the stage for that show, and that show was fucking nuts.
Oh, God.
And that was amazing. And that was where you really got to see their power.
Were they playing their own instruments?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doing some of that stuff. Doing everything that they did on a bigger tour, but for 2,000 people.
Yeah.
And I saw them later on that tour, maybe within a year, at Madison Square Garden, and I think I saw them once at the Forum in L.A. And I think I saw them somewhere. Oh, I saw them outside of D.C., somewhere in Virginia. I remember going to backstage with them and seeing their whole like lavish backstage setup. It was probably the first time I went to an arena backstage setup where they had like private caterer and all this stuff, and I was like, wow, this is insane. It's just amazing. It wasn't like, wow, I want to live this way. It was just like, wow, this is crazy. They have to set up all this stuff for one night and then break it down. That's wild.
Yeah.
You know, just for them to come out and perform. So I did get to see them a lot on tour. And as I said before, I got to work for them at Grand Royal for about 8 months, really the most intense 8 months of my life. And that was very cool, putting out Grand Royal magazine. It was insane. I used to say I worked 36-hour days, which I literally did. I would show up at 10 in the morning, not leave the office until... and keep going. Everyone else would come back, and I was still going until like 3 or 4 the next day. I'm like, I can't anymore.
Dude, that's insane.
Yeah, and that happened a lot, putting out that stuff.
They were on fire at that time too, with all their little side gigs. They had an extra large clothing company they were doing.
We were right down the street, and they did for the last issue when we did a demolition derby car, and we entered a demolition derby car in a a county fair thing, and Spike Jones drove the car. So we got X large to make us all matching coveralls. Which I still have. Very proud of those. That was fun. It was insane. Yeah, we made that happen in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks' time, we're like, we were trying to figure out a theme for the last issue of Grand Royal. And Mike said, well, we always wanted to do something with demo derbies. I was like, that's really cool. And I'm like, I love that. You know, the whole Evel Knievel thing, the whole demolition derby, like madness. I was like, I'm totally into that. And it's like, oh, well, find out where there's a demolition derby. And this was already August. And we're like, oh, like the last one we can find out about is happening in Tulare in 3 weeks. And then everyone was like, forget it then. I'm like, no. We're not forgetting anything. And we made it happen. I put together this crazy crew of people, and we made this thing happen in 3 weeks. It was so intense. It was like making a movie or something like that. I can't believe all these people sort of pitched in and made it happen. But yeah, we made it happen, and it was crazy. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, that was such a great. So you you got to look back and just be like, damn, I can't believe I did that.
There were a lot of wild moments.
You were from some right places at the right times, for sure.
Yeah, I got lucky. I mean, lots of other writers were in other senses too.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was a lot. Again, I think it had a little bit to do with access, but it also had a little bit to do with speaking up. And it was considered that media needed to be places to document them. Now people can document the stuff themselves. Oh, I don't care. I'm just going to go live on Instagram.
Yeah.
I don't need any media here to make sure it's documented well. But back then, you had to have media there. That's why I got to go to the first Tibetan Freedom Concert, also, which was also with the Beastie Boys thing.
Yeah.
And I was really proud to be able to champion that. And that's the San Francisco one, kids. That's not the big one in New York that everyone knows about. A year before that, they did a smaller one, even though it was still 30,000 people, I think, in Golden Gate Park.
Yeah.
And that was the one that was really amazing and really, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who did you miss out on? Who was it that you would like to have, if there was anybody during that time period?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. It's only older artists that I think of missing out on, sort of from the 60s and 70s maybe. As far as artists of that era, I'm really trying to think, because I'm sure there were. I mean, in some ways, I do regret missing out on Nirvana, but only because I would have been interested to see if I could have had a more interesting conversation with Cobain than it sounds like anyone ever had with him. Yeah. Because he was interested in a lot of cool stuff, and he was passionate about a lot of cool stuff. But you didn't hear that in his interviews. Yeah. It didn't really come out, And I think I was pretty good at getting people to talk about things that they didn't normally talk about. I think the Nick Cave interview is a good example of that. I think the Yoko Ono interview is a good example of that. I'm really, really proud of that interview, and I'm really glad that that's able to be in print finally. Cobain would have been interesting, not because I was the biggest fan in the world, but maybe I would have been able to get some expression out of him that no one else got, I don't know.
How about anyone that you thought would go further than they did? For me, I thought Jane's Addiction, Perry Farrell we're going to explode. And after Porno for Pyros, it was just they're done.
But they did. They're still around. Well, they were still around for a long. They came back a little bit.
Greatest hits don't count.
I mean, to a certain extent, that's their own fault. But, one other thought is, and to answer that question, but also the previous question, now that I think about it, I never got to interview Liz Phair on the level that I wanted to. And I do also think that she should have gone farther than she went. Some of her later work is incredibly good, and it's just under-regarded because I don't know why. But I interviewed her, but it wasn't the kind of interview that was like an important one. So I'm sorry I didn't interview her with more depth. That would have been really cool. And then, as far as Jane's Addiction, and you had asked me about them a little bit too. I actually had a ton of interaction with Perry Farrell, but not necessarily because of Jane's Addiction, because I ended up writing a lot about Lollapalooza in its original incarnation, because Alternative Press was really interested in covering that and seeing it develop and writing about it seriously. And we ended up writing about it more seriously than anyone else did anywhere. Rolling Stone, Spin, they didn't care. They were just like, oh, this is a festival, it's fun. And then trade magazines, they were only interested in revenues. They didn't really want to know the nuts and bolts of how this thing came together. So we really I wrote 2 or 3 big pieces and spent a lot of time researching that festival and everything involved with it and becoming connected to the people involved there, and finding out how it ticked, and learning about that business through that process. One of them was Perry Farrell. So I interviewed Perry for that. I'm sure I interviewed him for other sort of random things at random times. but I was never a massive Jane's fan. So I never sort of had the formal sit down, sort of like talk like that. It was just lots of random interactions. And I think the last random interaction was when he did something here in Vegas about 12 years ago. I was interacted with him there too. Really interesting character, very creative, also sort of semi-uncontrollable, semi-unfocused. And, it's wonderful, but also sometimes you're not gonna be Salvatore Dali if you don't manage that right, So I think to a certain extent, I don't know, it's probably Jane's own fault they didn't get bigger. I think the Porno for Pyros thing was a huge mistake. And in fact, there's a funny piece that I debated putting in the book, which is just a really, really long review of Porno for Pyros that is just completely tearing it apart. And that they did let me publish. And I was actually shocked they let me publish it. I think it was so over the top. They were like, oh, okay. I just tore that thing to shreds.
Yeah.
That was the worst record ever,
Yeah.
And it's just, there was so much expectation for it.
Yeah.
And some people made excuses for it too. And I'm like, stop. Please stop. It's not good. It's not good on their own terms.
No. That was, you go from ritual de la habitual to that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, what?
Come on, guys.
Yeah. Now, some of the bands you ever cross paths with, like maybe No Means No out of Canada, or Mike Watt.
Mike Watt. I wrote about Mike Watt, one of his projects at one point. He's a kooky guy. He's still,
I love that guy.
As far as I can tell, he's still the same guy he's always was.
Yeah,
Just kind of like Mr. Meat and Potatoes. Let's get up and do it.
Yeah.
And putting people together and doing crazy stuff.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was, but it was one of his crazy like projects where he got all these other people involved that I wrote about. Yeah, he was cool.
Nice. Nice. See who else. Mary's Danish. They were one of those
the Canadian
bands.
band.
No, they were.
LA?
Yeah, they were.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
LA.
No,
They
never
had two
really.
female singers.
No.
Okay.
No.
Big Black. You were on the East Coast. Cross paths with.
I had a little bit of interaction with Albini. He produced a bunch of stuff that I also liked. My band opened for Rape Man. I always thought Rape Man was a way better band than Big Black, personally.
Yeah.
That's just my personal taste. Big Black was another band that everyone thought was amazing, and I was like, I don't got it. But then Rape Man came along, I'm like, okay, I get Rape Man. I thought they were great. Obviously, everyone's offended by the name of it,
Right.
and so now we're acting like it never even happened. I also thought that the records he did with Palehead with Ian MacKaye were the coolest thing either one of them ever did.
Oh yeah.
But Shwa, this is like, you're seeing my taste.
Yeah.
I picked these things that everyone else was like, oh, that's okay too.
Yeah.
No. Palehead.
Yeah.
Fugazi, not so much.
Yeah.
Palehead. This is how I get myself into trouble.
I have similar tastes. That's why I'm so
Yeah.
intrigued. But you mentioned Butthole Surfers. How about Gibby and that whole crowd?
Yeah.
Larry?
King Coffee, when he had his label, actually, I did a lot of stuff. I supported a lot of stuff on his label because he put out a lot of really cool stuff. And this is a weird side note. So Gibby, when he had his label, not Gibby, King, when he had his label, was trying to help Rocky Erickson and bring him back. It was one of the first times people were sort of trying to bring back Rocky Erickson, Texas legend, fried on acid, considered to be just like gone. He's the Texas Syd Barrett.
Yeah.
And so they were like, oh, we're bringing Rocky back. He's playing shows and stuff. They're like, do you want to just go spend a day with Rocky and see what you think and what you want to write about it, And this was another moment where I sort of felt like, oh, look at me. I'm so big. They're giving me a day with Rocky Erickson, and it's no obligation. So I literally spent a day. This is in maybe 96. I spent a day hanging out with Rocky Erickson. Went over to his family's house, hung out in his apartment, which was horrible and horrifying. It was almost like a serial killer's apartment. There were like 20 TVs going at all times. All this white noise. It smelled like the gym locker's gym locker. It smelled terrible. His sheets were filthy. It was scary. And yeah, I hung out with him there. And he was not well.
Yeah.
He was not well at all. And it was really interesting. And at the end, I was really, really uncomfortable writing about it. And the only thing I would have written was to say, this is terrible.
Yeah.
And the idea of bringing him back is such a misplaced priority.
Wow.
But no one wanted to hear that.
Yeah.
So that story never happened, but the experience always stayed with me. Yeah. I don't think I ever interacted directly with Gibby though. But he was involved with the Revolting Cocks stuff a little bit too. Yeah.
How about Paul Westerberg replacements?
No, not really.
But so then Bob Mould's probably not.
Not really. He wasn't a big Minneapolis guy.
Now, what about for us West Coast? You ever cross paths with Jello Biafra and that alternative tentacle crowd?
I feel like I interviewed Jello at some point or another. Yeah, not about. I can't remember what it was about, but I think I did. I think Jello is exactly who you think he is, and he's an incendiary guy. He's probably the closest thing to an American Johnny Rotten.
Yeah.
Very sharp thinker, but very, very
Eccentric.
opinionated and eccentric, his own person. But important, really important. It's amazing. I worked in a record store when the original Dead Kennedys thing was happening, and people were just outraged that the band was even called Dead Kennedys. And I remember we carried the records, and then we had to stop carrying the records. And I'm like, they're just called Dead Kennedys. It's not even specific Kennedys,
Yeah.
It was amazing what people chose to be outraged about.
Well, that's what killed the Replacements, is they had that one song about suicide. And then a year or two later, one of the hair bands came out with a song about suicide, and it was one of the most popular bands. MTV Let It Go, and, it's just one of those hit or misses, I mean, Jay Masick, Dinosaur Jr., he was another one who never really went huge in the MTV world at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it was, the whole world was really interesting because what was alternative? And people were trying to define alternative. There were a lot of misfits, a lot of people who, frankly, didn't really want to be successful. They didn't have designs on being huge pop stars. Jay Mascis, who I saw Dinosaur before they were Dinosaur Jr., actually. It's like, this guy doesn't want to be that popular. He wants to play at this level, and he's amazing at this level. He doesn't want to play arenas. You can tell. Why? Because of the way he's presenting himself in his whole thing. It's like, and that's cool. That's great. Yeah. But it's like, that was the whole thing. That's at the crux of what my Sonic Youth piece is about. It's about who decided that they're going to be a pop, they're going to be on MTV and they're going to be big now. It doesn't even make any sense, And I think that's what I was trying to get at with that piece, which it didn't work right in the published version. And then I went back and transcribed. I was able to find the old cassettes, which is amazing, in the middle of COVID, and retranscribe the interviews and piece them back together. And I'm proud of the interviews. I think they're really good interviews. But that was the whole thing. It was like, who decided Sonic Youth should be on MTV?
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with the fact that they're not they shouldn't have been interested in that. But if I had approached that with a sort of pure heart, so to speak, I would have been the guy saying, "What are you doing? Why are you in Geffen Records? What are you going to do on MTV? Who are you kidding?"
Well, I mean, you should read Kim Gordon's book.
No.
Oh, it's great. It's great. But she was an art kid. She was an artist.
Yeah.
That's Sonic Youth. Is there an art movement more so than
looked at it as an art project.
Yeah.
That's what she talks about in this. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. That's what makes it great. That's what I loved seeing Sonic Youth when they played CBGBs and didn't care. And they weren't even playing a set list. They're just playing. And it was amazing. Really amazing. But it's like, you can't package that and sell it to the Midwest and put it in Walmart. You can't. And you're not. And it's fine. It's actually really good that you can't do that, because that needs to be what that is. So there was so much dichotomy in the 90s, and this is what I ended up sort of writing about different ways. You know, what are we doing here? What are we talking about? This makes sense as pop music. This is never going to make sense as pop music. Stop thinking that these things should be considered on the same level. Stop treating them the same way. And this is what I kind of fought about. And this is, if there's any tension in this book, that's what it is. You know, it's like living through that era where people were trying to stuff things into bags that they didn't belong in. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, MTV. That was what they.
You had to be on MTV,
and they killed the desert rock scene. I mean, bands like the Meat Puppets and Thin White Rope. You know, they never got the
right. It was like, if you're not on MTV, you're never going to make it. And I was very friendly with Matt Pinfield, who ended up being 120 Minutes host. I'm still friendly with him, actually. And God bless him that he did what he could to give these bands exposure. But the reality is, and I think that exposure really helped people who were isolated.
Yeah.
And related to this stuff. And there's stories all over the place about someone being like, man, I didn't even live in Topeka. I lived outside of Topeka. And I never would have found this stuff if I hadn't seen 120 Minutes. I mean, he gets that stuff all the time. Oh, yeah. So it was great for that. But at the same time, as I said, Nick Cave was never going to have a top 10 hit. And he didn't want to have a top 10 hit, because if he did, he would have covered Ring of Fire. Unironically. Yeah. You know? He absolutely could have had top 10 hits if that's what he wanted to do. He could have been Brian Ferry all over again.
Yeah.
He made very conscious decision to never do that. And he's had an amazing career without that. But I guess that's my point, and then my sort of short rant, you know.
It's funny, that just reminded me of Mojo Nixon.
Yeah.
Because there was one that was going, you know, kind of trying to go against that grain.
Right.
But then MTV just used that as like a Weird Al kind of thing.
Totally. And They Might Be Giants.
Oh,
too.
Yeah. Total one of the most talented, amazing bands out there.
But a weirdo art band, really. Yeah. And all of a sudden they're like Weird Al Yankovic. Yeah. That's what they tried to do to Ween a little bit. Yeah. And that's what, you know, that's what all these bands are sort of like novelties, you know. And it's just, there's a difference between art and novelty, you know. But I think everyone was so afraid to go against the sort of machine at the time that's you just kind of got what you were handed, I think.
Well, and that was one of the last hurrahs of money in music, too. Yeah. They were like throwing bands money left and right, you know. I mean, these bands had like maybe a single or two, and then all of a sudden, you know, they've got all this money behind them to go.
It was crazy to go through and have friends bands who were barely playing bars have all these bidding wars over them, as they call it, bidding war. It's so funny. I mean, it's just like, I had to write about this stuff, and it's just, you want to roll your eyes, and it's just like, what are you doing? You know, you shouldn't be signing with any of these labels if it's about a bidding war. You know, that's not they're not going to support you for who you are. They're going to be constantly trying to make you something you're not. You know, or you're never really going to get the attention from them anyway. You know, I don't think Mudhoney really got the attention they should have gotten from Warner Brothers, Reprise, or whoever it was. Yeah. And I don't think that was anyone's fault, but let's be honest. How is that going to work? You know?
Well, and, you know, as always, like anything, they find something they can just squeeze all the juice out of. You know, a Red Hot Chili Pepper band. Yeah. And that's, you know, nonstop all they want to focus on.
Right.
But now, how'd you end up here in Vegas? So you're doing the music. We'll transition here.
Okay. So the Vegas thing was sort of an eventuality, but basically what happened was I was in the music scene. I was writing about a lot of stuff. It was great. It was starting to get a little old, which is why I started writing about film as much. I was really interested in writing about indie film, and then I ended up taking a job with Us Weekly, actually, and so I started writing about mainstream film and celebrity and all that stuff, and I was very well paid, and it was the best of times and worst of times at the same time. I had fantastic access to really cool things, but at the same time I had to write about it in ways that were sometimes demeaning, you know, or I had to report about scandals, you know, and that's just like, that's not who I want to be. I don't enjoy that. I don't feel good about it, you know. But I did that for a couple of years, and at the same time, my wife at the time had decided she wanted to get out of the music industry, and she wanted to open a restaurant. And so I was like, that's nice. good. I'm here to support you. That's great. And long story short, she ended up sort of dragging me into that project bit by bit, ended up being the principal investor, ended up concepting the thing, ended up helping her build the look and the feel and all of it, everything except the food pretty much. It was even involved in the cocktail program because it was one of the first kind of classic cocktail programs at the time when people were just barely starting to talk about it, especially in LA. I insisted that we have rye on the bar, and everyone was like, "What's rye?" I swear to God. And you could only get 2 ryes at the time. And so we got Old Overholt, and Old Overholt was so down market at the time that it was in plastic bottles.
So you were not only making mixtapes, you were a mixologist as well?
A little bit. And I got a little bit, and I actually got more into that when I started writing about, I did write about cocktails later on. But so I helped her open this restaurant as a sort of silent partner. And then at the end of it, we split up almost right after it was opened. And I wasn't totally done with music, but I really felt like I was mostly kind of burnt out by it. So, and I'd gotten a taste of the restaurant industry, which I really liked restaurants, but I was very intimidated by it at the time. And I didn't make any sense to me. But after after getting involved with that project, I thought, well, this world's really interesting. Chefs are interesting. People are starting to talk about chefs a little bit the way they talk about musicians. And I thought that was kind of cool. So, very long story short, I was interested in writing more about food and wine and travel. Being a travel writer seemed like fun. Seemed like that would be fun. And it is fun. But it's very hard to get paid, long story short. But it is a lot of fun. So all of that came into play. And then I got a job with America Online working on their Las Vegas City Guide out of LA. And they said, well, this guy who's creating content for us wants to do a blog. So we're going to let him do a blog. His name is Robin Leach. And I said, the Robin Leach? Yeah. His show's off the air. No one cares about him anymore. And I said, I think people still care about him. No. No one cares about him. But we're just doing this to make him happy. So you're the new guy. You're going to have to deal with him. And I'm like, okay. So I got to work with Robin. I got to rework his blog. And within 3 months, we were getting 1 million hits a month on America Online, with the first blog to really talk about Las Vegas in the modern era and what was going on with the club scene here and all of that stuff, because prior to that, no one was really writing about it in that way. So Robin basically said, when are you coming out to Vegas? You're my guy. I was like, okay. I'd been out to Vegas a few times before. I knew Vegas, but I wasn't spending a lot of time out here. So I came out, and he literally introduced me around town, which was amazing, and I'll never forget it. And I got all his introductions, and I thought, well, this is really interesting. I never saw myself in Vegas, but there's a whole lot of opportunity here, and it's kind of cool. So I started going back and forth between LA and Vegas, and did that for about 8 years before I sort of made it. I was like, this is silly. I'm doing more in Vegas than I am in LA. And then I moved here. Yeah, full time. That was 2015.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah. And then sort of the very last, even though I was done with music writing, my friend Melinda Shekels was editing a magazine out here called 944 at the time. She asked me to do her a favor and go in the studio with this band who was recording a demo in the Killer's studio and just write a short piece about them. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. And that band was called Imagine Dragons. Uh-huh. So that is almost literally the last music piece I ever wrote. It's kind of fun.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Who's on your playlist these days? Who you listen to? Anybody new, or is it just?
It's all over the place. Yeah, a little bit of new music, but I forget a lot of the names. But Florence and the Machine I like a lot. Trying to think of who else new that I really love. I really like Youngblood, actually. I like him a lot. And there's just other bands from different eras that I'll listen to. I'm pretty eclectic. I'm all over the place. I listen to a lot of old jazz at home now, more than anything.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So,
Let's see. Did we leave anything else? Are you writing now? Or you got anything new? We got another book on the way of the Leech years.
The Leech years. That sounds very strange. I love Rob and I love my experience with him. I don't know if I could turn that into a book, though. But there's a couple other book projects that are very tangential and different from this. I don't know if they'll ever happen, actually. I thought about compiling some of my other stuff, but I guess I'd have to see how well this book does. So go out and buy it, folks.
Yeah, anything but Nirvana. Out on paperback now.
I think it's entertaining. I hope it's entertaining.
It's very entertaining, and I like how you, in the beginning of each chapter, each interview, you kind of go over where you were at, kind of talk about, kind of preface everyone, which I think it's great. You get to capture a little bit of you now and then.
Perspective's always perspective has always been really, really important to me. Even in it, whether you're in the moment or looking back. It was interesting to me to see what things I remembered about the stories or what I felt was important to say about a story. Because sometimes it was about what was happening at the time. Sometimes it was about process. Sometimes about the form of the stories. Because I also thought there's not a lot of books out there that talk about feature writing and the process of doing it. So at least I could put a little bit in here about like, hey, you have to think about this and you have to do this and so forth and so on. I really tried to be creative with the form. Like you mentioned new journalism before. I was really, really influenced by the new journalism of the 60s and the 70s. And when it came to the 90s, I was just like, where did it all go? What, do we just give up? We just give up on being creative? So I tried to be creative in the writing itself, too. And you're going to hit and miss when you do that.
Well, and what I like about it, too, is as music fans, especially at that time period, I was from one of those towns that, you had to stay up all night to get 120 minutes or travel to L.A. or San Francisco to get Ray Gun Magazine,
right.
And so
I love my time with Ray Gun Magazine.
When you get to read these stories, you're there. It's not just interviews. Right. Which you have the interviews too, but it's nice to that real journalism where you're like on the ground with you,
That's
running
cool.
through the people and trying to get a VIP pass, and then being critical of it at the same time,
Absolutely.
loving every minute of it. I mean that's those are good stories. Good stories, and I think fans that not only love that of all ages who love that music will really appreciate what you got here, because it really just encapsulates it and puts you right there on the ground of so many of those scenes that you were fortunate enough to cover.
Cool. I hope so.
Yeah.
Thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad. I definitely wanted you to be the first after you brought the book in. I was like, dude, I've read your articles. What the hell? I mean, that was such a special time period for a lot of people who were music fans. And at that time, to be a music fan, you were hardcore, you know? And it's not like you're just playing Spotify playlists and like, oh, I like that last song.
True. Yeah.
You were searching stuff out, finding it, trading mixed tapes with people.
You really, I mean, that was the last era, and I touch about this a little bit too. Those last era was like, you would draw a line in the sand about this band or that band. No.
Yeah.
That band sucks, I can't talk to you. You're not my friend.
Definitely.
We can't go out.
You judge people by their music taste,
right?
For sure.
Yeah, it's so funny. But now it all mixes together, and people are like, that's cool or whatever. You can have this style, and you don't have to believe those beliefs. So you can have this style, whatever.
Yeah. Two bands I recommend for you that might give you a little nostalgia, but they're new. It's a young kid out of the Midwest named Juice Box. You got 3 X's at the end of box.
Okay.
And then Surfboard.
Huh.
They're out of a female lead singer out of, I want to say New York, but I could be wrong there. To fairly new, but still up and coming bands that got real. I mean, Juicebox sounds like a new school Adam Horovitz. poor kid from the Midwest doing hip hop punk.
Yeah.
And then Surfboard's your classic grungy punk female lead singer, kind of Kathleen Hanna style.
Nice, cool.
Fun lyrics, though. I mean, I'm a big lyrics guy, so if the
me
lyrics
too.
are stupid, then
right. I like La Tigre, for example.
Yeah.
They're not brand new. They're obviously not new at this point, but yeah. As I was always a big fan of them. So I love that pod a lot.
Eric Gladstone,
Cool.
Thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate you,
Shwa.
dude.
It was a pleasure and an honor.
I'd like to thank Eric Gladstone for joining us today. Eric Gladstone's book, Anything But Nirvana, is available at avantpopbooks.com or in Las Vegas at the Avantpop Bookstore. The theme music for Avantpop Bookstore Presents is performed by artist Dillashu. And I hope you can join us again for another edition of Avantpop Bookstore Presents.